Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to Vaccines and the Misinformation Hydra. This event is hosted by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, your community for science and secularism. My name is Mark Maharaj. I am the office manager and volunteer with Centre for Inquiry Canada. I'd also like to introduce my co-host, Shauna Watson, Vice President of CFIC, who will be taking care of the Q&A session following the talk. CFIC is Canada's only national nonprofit with the mission of promoting and educating the public on critical thinking, science, and secularism. We work to equip people to make decisions based on evidence, rational thinking, and compassion. To that end, we hold events like this to provide an opportunity for you to engage with subject matter experts on a variety of topics. In these days of physical distancing, all of CFIC's events and activities are provided online, available from coast to coast to coast. We rely entirely on donations and memberships to allow us to bring you events such as this. Please visit our website, centreforinquiry.ca, or email info@centreforinquiry.ca for more information about how to become a member or make a donation. We will be recording this talk for publication on CFIC's YouTube channel, including the Q&A session. If you do not want your name or image to appear in the recording, please turn off your camera and change your screen name. And to minimize background noise, if we can, to mute everyone.
We've got it figured out now.
Thank you. Okay, to minimize background noise, we have muted everyone's microphone. After the discussion, there will be opportunity to ask questions by text using the Zoom chat window. Now I'd like to introduce our guest, Kavin Senapathy. Kavin is a writer, journalist, and speaker. She covers science, health, food, and parenting. Her writing has appeared in outlets like Slate, The Daily Beast, On Dark, Self, and Forbes. And she is the co-founder and contributing editor at SciMoms.com. She has also spoken to a variety of audiences ranging from tens to thousands worldwide. Welcome, Kavin.
Well, thanks for having me. Am I free to get started now, or did you have anything else?
Yep, free to start.
Yeah, you're good to go.
Okay. Well, thanks again to CFI Canada for inviting me to speak today. And thanks to everyone for coming. I'm excited to see around 50 participants today. So I'm here with you today to talk about something that, of course, matters a whole lot to all of us. And this talk is about vaccines, which, of course, are among the greatest medical success stories really in modern civilization, and something that we're desperately waiting to get right now. And I hope get this pandemic over with if these new variants don't put any big hiccups in that plan. All right, and then this talk is also about science communication, often shortened to SciComm. It's a fairly new term that's been around since the late 80s or so. And it's basically any communication about science to the so-called public from various entities. So these entities include the media, governments, academia, scientists, and other content producers, and more. So what does and doesn't constitute SciComm is a matter of contention in the broader science and communication spheres. But nevertheless, SciComm is often bandied about as the antidote to misinformation about science. Now, I sometimes do SciComm, although that's just a part of the writing and journalism that I do. I got into this in 2011 after I had my first child. I was a new mom who was terrified of everything really potentially hurting my baby. And I later realized that what I was going through was postpartum OCD. And it was pretty dark, but fortunately I was able to pull myself out of the worst of it after a few months with the help of meds. And I didn't want to live in this kind of nebulous terror for the rest of my life. So I set to work figuring out how to pull out all of the credible stuff from the BS, which was a game changer really as far as life skills go for me. But part of that was learning to comb through the primary literature. And shortly thereafter, I started doing it professionally. So soon I found myself sort of knee deep in the world of science communication, and I quickly became a devotee. And it was clear to me that you don't have to have OCD for parenting to be terrifying. And there were profiteers scaring parents about, well, really everything. We're talking about epidural anesthesia during childbirth, chemicals in sunscreen, chemicals on fruits and veggies, screen time, the wrong kind of baby carrier, chemicals in infant formula, anything unnatural, not gazing lovingly into your baby's eyes for most of its waking moments. And that's just to name a few that I remember from that time, and many of which are still prevalent today. And of course, there are those who benefit either ideologically or financially from scaring people away from vaccines. So as my body of work grew, my reporting has involved a raft of scientific, industry, and medical experts, and just regular people living the lives that intersect with my beats, which, as Mark mentioned, are science, parenting, health, and food, sort of broadly. So for a while, I saw myself as this science wielding misinformation slayer, and I was joining forces with others who strive to address bad information wherever it strikes. But time and again, I encountered a common unsettling thread that runs through all of it. And that's that the forces that seek to correct widespread misinformation about science, including misinformation about vaccines, have been effectively cutting off the heads of what I call the Misinformation Hydra. So I'm about to make the case that decades of communication about science targeted at the so-called public about everything from vaccines to mainstream science-based medicine to GMOs to nuclear energy and more, that this communication has struggled to eliminate science denialism because it overlooks social injustices that are part and parcel of science itself. So what this talk is not going to be is a debunking of common vaccine hesitancy misinformation or a refutation of certain documentaries that purport to reveal the harmful truth about vaccines, or an explanation of how vaccines work, or even a catalog of the most wacky anti-vaccine views, although we will touch on a few of those. So what this talk will do is explore why vaccine hesitation is so pervasive, despite all of the science-clad facts to support all of the medically recommended vaccines. We'll also shed light on the SciComm landscape when it comes to vaccines and explain why so many SciComm professionals compare their jobs to a game of whack-a-mole. So it's that arcade game with the big mallet and the moles pop out, and you whack the moles down and they keep popping up as you whack them. So I could certainly do a lovely wonders of science type of talk on how different vaccines work. I've recently done a bunch of writing about how different viruses infect us and how all of their little parts interact with our cells. And COVID, for one, does quite a number on our cells, but that's not for today. The question today is whether science communication can be the solution to the spread of misinformation about science, about vaccines. And the answer lies in this hydra, which I'll get to shortly. Now, in the interest of some lighthearted self-deprecation, I'll share with you my background as a glorified mommy blogger answering the tough questions. So I've cultivated a vantage point that's helped me visualize the science communication arena from an aerial view, including where science communication encounters the issue of vaccines. So here you'll see my trading card from SciMoms.com, which is a website that I co-founded and that focuses on evidence-based living and parenting. So the purpose of today is to paint a picture of the vaccine communication landscape based on my experiences and observations as a journalist and a science writer and a mom of two, and also as a fan of just knowing the truth about important stuff. And of course, there will be evidence. There is a science to science communication, and the literature and data are fascinating. I'm a kind of a SciComm nerd, among other things that I geek out about. And so by the end of this talk, I hope you'll understand what I mean by Misinformation Hydra. So for the purposes of this talk, we'll assume that all recommended vaccines are hugely beneficial to individuals and pose a vanishingly low risk to the vast majority of people. Fortunately, I think this audience will not be taking issue with that assumption. Vaccines, of course, save millions of lives per year. And more than 1 million people die from vaccine preventable illness each year. So these are, of course, the ironclad facts. But studies show that vaccine opposition could undermine COVID efforts. The COVID efforts, excuse me. In 2019, the World Health Organization included vaccine hesitancy in its list of the top 10 threats to global health. So vaccines, of course, are generally pretty awesome, but people still don't like them, or they still have doubts about them. And we know that opposition to vaccines started, of course, well before the emergence of SARS-CoV-2. You probably remember the recent measles outbreaks, for instance, that happened due to drop in vaccination rates in a few parts of the United States. Now, that's because of herd immunity. It happens when a large enough percentage of a community has immunity to a given infectious disease. There we go. And so when that happens, the whole community is protected. And it's kind of terrifying that herd immunity is waning against diseases that we've successfully fought back. And it also raises the question that tons of researchers have been asking. And namely, that question is, why do people choose to forego vaccines? So the late 1990s gave birth to the contemporary so-called anti-vaccine movement. For one, the 1990s is when the now disgraced former gastroenterologist, Andrew Wakefield, published a fraudulent paper linking immunizations with autism. And I cannot stress this enough, that vaccines have never caused autism. I don't have time during this talk to get into all of the science that proves that vaccines don't cause autism. And of course, all of the ableism inherent in that notion in the first place. But as for the 90s, of course, the 90s is when the internet became widely available as well, which gave us all this gift of misinformation at our fingertips, or excuse me, gift of information at our fingertips, and sort of the curse of misinformation at our fingertips. Now, in addition to Wakefield, a cast of characters that occupies the current vaccine denial landscape emerged in the 90s. An epidemiologist and science communicator, Dr. Tara C. Smith, who's a professor at the Kent State University College of Public Health, described this cast of characters in a 2017 article. So these roughly include doctors and other so-called experts that don't sort of follow the mainstream guidance, celebrities, of course, and then you have organizers and activists, you have mommy bloggers, and other opportunists and profiteers. Now, here are some of that cast of characters, and as well as some of the most common themes in the contemporary vaccine denial movement. And while the specifics of vaccine denial details vary, there are some themes that hold true, and studies suggest that these themes hold true around the world. So you'll see some of those listed here. The general vaccines contain harmless X or Y harmless chemical or other thing that that makes you feel uneasy. And then, of course, that vaccines shed virus from the people who get them, which enter the bodies of others. That vaccines are a tool of big pharma, that natural immunity is better, that the vaccine schedule introduces too many vaccines too soon, the old "we can't trust our government and medical institutions to protect us," and then the big question of the removal of bodily autonomy. Now, I've had run-ins with a few of these people you see here, and because I'm going to be empathetic to some of these themes, I want to make clear how very dangerous and unethical this cast of characters has been. So for instance, on the upper left, you see Dr. Joe Mercola, and he is there encouraging people to listen to his podcast and take control of your health. But really, he's trying to take control of your wallet. Now, I've covered Mercola. He's capitalized on he capitalized, excuse me, on the internet right away in the 90s when he positioned himself as a more trustworthy alternative to mainstream medicine. And he founded Mercola.com, which is a natural health blog and really an e-commerce empire. He was one of the early adopters of the now common shtick from this larger cast of characters. Basically, it's that he's protecting people from big pharma, toxic chemicals, and greedy doctors. In 2017, I was quoted in a piece about him in The Ringer, in which I say that Joseph Mercola is among the top misinformation vectors of our time. Now, if you look over at the image on the lower right-hand side, you'll see Dr. Oz, who is one of America's most famous TV doctors. And he is there fear-mongering about one of the most common themes, which is that dangerous and scary chemicals are in in vaccines. In this case, thimerosal. Now, of course, calling thimerosal mercury is a common trick. Mercury is a naturally occurring element found in the Earth's crust and soil and water, and methylmercury and ethylmercury are very different. So thimerosal contains ethylmercury, which prevents the growth of harmful pathogens in multi-dose vials. a vaccine. And methylmercury is the type of mercury found in certain kinds of fish. And at high exposure levels, methylmercury and not ethylmercury can be toxic to people. But the idea that we're injecting our kids with mercury is disturbing, and I don't exactly blame people for falling for it. Now, since the 90s, SciComm has turned its sights to the contemporary anti-vaccine movements. And that communication, as I mentioned, comes from governments, medical institutions, academia, media, scientists and researchers, and some tenacious volunteers who totally deserve props. And there are a few examples here of that science communication. I would say that well done, accurate, accessible science-based information about vaccines is a crucial public health service. Now, Andrew Wakefield and his ilk seem like an entirely contemporary phenomenon. So it might be surprising to learn that anti-vaccine sentiment is nothing new. So I really find these old propaganda pieces fascinating. So here you see a few examples of this old anti-vaccine propaganda, like the sermon pamphlet is from the 18th century. And if you look at the third from the left, there is a lot going on. So it depicts a police officer holding back this mother as her infant is forcibly vaccinated. And it also suggests that there's a big pharma conspiracy to oppose sanitation measures. So I'm not sure if you're able to read this, but you see there's money in it. 20,000 victims will be vaccinated within the next 10 days in this city under the present alarm. That will put $10,000 into the pocket of the medical profession. Cleanliness, sanitation, and hygiene are nonsense, unworthy of attention by our Board of Health. Filthy streets, filthy lanes, and filthy drains help the medical profession. There is money in it. So the reasoning behind this conspiracy theory is going strong today in contemporary contemporary vaccine denial, that it was sanitation alone that eliminated vaccine preventable disease and not vaccination. So yeah, the vaccine denial has been around since smallpox, and it hasn't changed a whole lot. Now, there have been times and places where vaccines have been mandated, but mandating vaccines is something that public officials tend to be wary about, as it is walking a thin line between violating bodily autonomy and individual liberties. So it's tricky, and it tends not to go over well. So it's tempting to think that what's left is to explain that anti-vaccine propaganda isn't true, and to share the facts and educate about the science and convince more people to vaccinate voluntarily. And that's true to a point, but it's a big but. As Dr. Tara Smith wrote in that article, one impulse many scientists may have is to simply educate the public, known as the information deficit model of science communication. This model assumes that the public is merely under uneducated or undereducated about vaccines, and that providing additional factual information will fill this knowledge gap and lead people toward vaccinating. And unfortunately, information alone has not been shown to increase vaccine confidence among hesitant parents. So it's no surprise that lots of folks in science communication compare their task to a game of whack-a-mole. So I asked this question on Twitter recently for the purposes of a project I'm working on about science communication that covers all of the issues that I'm interested in, including vaccines, but also alternative medicine, GMOs, and the general opposition to chemicals. And several folks answered. Some said that they regularly describe their task as being like whack-a-mole, while others had similar analogies. So one compared it to the 1980s arcade game Galaga, which I had actually never played. And another suggested that it's like putting out fires that keep reigniting. So what ties all of these together is this imagery of an enemy that won't die. So for the past few years, I've visualized it as cutting the heads off of what I call the Misinformation Hydra, which is a version of the mythical beast with heads that grow back when you slay them. And this is a model that allows us to visualize that the misinformation problem is not only never ending, but also that it is systemic. So I'll talk you through a basic diagram of what I'm talking about. So here's the Misinformation Hydra as it pertains to vaccines, and a few examples of those heads. And so its heads are this misinformation that keep popping back up. So conspiracy theories are part of it. So Bill Gates has become like the anti-vaccine scapegoat du jour. And so is the misinformation about chemicals, as well as real or perceived rise in chronic illnesses and autism and so on. And so I've been and often am this brave soul here with the sword. This figure here represents science communication. And the sword itself is all of the evidence and scientific explanations and refutations of misinformation. And so as you can see, the misinformation slayers are quite exhausted. That's because it's impossible for science communicators armed with a misinformation slaying sword of evidence to vanquish this hydra. Now, many SciComm folks do a few additional things that do help make headway. One of them in green is what I call arming people with a misinformation radar. So not only does some vaccine communication refute misinformation, it also teaches people to spot and identify misinformation before they fall for it. So it's sort of an inoculation effect. Not long back, actually, I documented in a chapter I wrote for the 2017 book, Pseudoscience, The Conspiracy Against Science. I thought that this misinformation radar alone was the missing part that made the Hydra immortal, that enough of those that SciComm folks call the public just don't know how to identify misinformation about science when they see it. So that was a few years ago. But since then, I've seen that there's more to it. I call them the Hydra's lifeblood. So it's heart and it's underbelly. Basically, science communication is not equipped to slay this beast on its own. And too many people in science communication don't know this. And yet too many others, myself included, we really know it all too well. And let me stress again that this doesn't mean that providing credible information isn't worth it. Indeed, some of people's doubts about vaccinating are genuine and fairly basic. And we've heard from all kinds of people that we have changed their minds about giving their child one or more vaccines. So I certainly call that a win. But SciComm has been given an unfair burden that it can't carry on its own. So in that body of the Hydra in its heart lives the innate desire of individuals to control their own fates and deep and justified anxieties for which proxies take the blame. And I'll explain that in a moment. Then there's also the false anti-science versus pro-science dichotomy. And both sides typically represent the more extreme views, but these two extremes are also the most visible. And then you have the underbelly, where the most marginalized are overlooked as they face the brunt of injustice. This includes the injustices that occur in the absence of science-based thinking, as well as the injustices perpetrated by the forces of science itself. Now, the food industry can give us some insight into vaccine hesitancy, interestingly enough. So there are some examples here of what people are worried about, or the proxies, versus the real injustices that those proxies represent. So some of those proxies, when it comes to vaccines, include the toxic chemicals, the big pharma conspiracy theories, or the idea that Bill Gates is trying to implant microchips into us. Now, what's especially interesting and relevant here is also that this Clean Label Manifesto iceberg graphic is from an organization called the Clean Label Project. They're a third-party certifying agency that certifies restaurants in the US, like Panera Bread and others, as so-called clean, as well as supermarket food products, personal care and baby products, and all sorts of other things. Now, Clean Label Project understands this landscape well, and it knows how to tap into it and exploit it. It's no different with the cast of characters that drive anti-vaccine misinformation. So allow me to tell a story. A recent example unfolded before my eyes when I attended a local public health meeting in my city of Madison, Wisconsin, which is, for those of you who know Chicago, about 2 hours north of Chicago. The committee took public comment on a proposed proposition statement to eliminate personal and religious vaccine exemptions for public school attendance. It was a record-setting attendance for this type of public hearing. There were a few people there to give testimony on why they support eliminating these vaccine exemptions. A couple of them were physicians reading data from study after study out loud, showing the harms of not vaccinating. But most of the people at the meeting that day were there to object to eliminating philosophical exemptions to vaccines for attending public school. And a few of these testimonies stood out to me. So one was a tall, well-dressed chiropractor with this sort of dazzling smile, which I could tell he'd had a lot of expensive dental work. And he boasted his pharma-free practice. He explained that he proudly treats children, and it seems that he markets himself as a more personable, less sort of establishmentarian replacement for the traditional primary care physician. So this chiropractor raised some of the usual objections to mandating vaccines. Another person giving testimony was a self-proclaimed proud stay-at-home mom. And I, of course, can't generalize, but she presented as a white woman with a comfortable life. And she expressed genuine anger at the medical establishment for taking away her autonomy as her children's mother. Now, another person there to comment was a Black mother with similar sentiments. She voiced her worry over the historic exploitation of Black people by the medical establishment. And another Black mother seemed deeply distressed, and she too insisted that she will not allow what she perceived to be the further erosion of her rights as a woman and a mother. So what do these people have in common, and what brought them to the same public health meeting? So chiropractors are a whole other story, and I've covered them enough to understand quite well that chiropractors, who of course eschew the science on a number of ailments that they purport to treat, are really these shiny, sometimes sleazy, outward symptom of deep-seated distrust of mainstream medicine. Now, parents in the audience, or anyone with a maternal relationship with someone else, or parental relationship, I should say, we know how fierce that our instinct to protect is. So even if that instinct is misguided at times, I do identify with it. Now, you'll recall that among what science communication is equipped to do, there's arming people with a misinformation radar that is arming people with the tools to unravel information and separate the credible from the not so credible. Now, this includes explaining the type of health science related studies, the types of health science related studies and how to interpret them. For instance, observational data come from studies in which researchers observe what people do in the real world and measure the outcomes, whereas a randomized controlled trial assigns one group to receive an intervention while another receives a placebo. Now, all studies deal with limitations, but when you understand what the common limitations are, you then have a tool with which to assess bad coverage of new health studies. And I can't get into all of the tools that make up a solid misinformation radar in this talk, but I'll touch on risk perception. When we understand what risk really is, we begin to understand how to unravel propaganda that blows risks of various exposures totally out of proportion. So risk perception is nearly always irrational. We tend to worry more or less than the evidence suggests that we should. We're hardwired to take shortcuts that we're not consciously aware of. And uncertainty makes everything seem more dangerous. And there are ways to teach people to assess risk in a more evidence-based way. But none of us can evaluate the evidence on everything. And none of us is immune to irrational risk perception, however much one might consider themselves to be a critical thinker. And it's no different with those who worry about vaccines. So this image isn't to scale, but it illustrates the big picture when it comes to health hazards and the magnitude of risk. So risk is a population-based measure. So the question is, what's an individual to do? Now, as the Sci Moms, we think it makes sense to try and control our modifiable risk factors, especially the ones that have a big impact, like the ones pictured here on the big trees. But there are many more than those pictured here. So you could think of everything from contaminated drinking water to extreme levels of stress. All of these risk factors absolutely do impact someone's likelihood of all kinds of outcomes, from cancer to chronic health problems, to the severity of infectious diseases when you contract them. Those of us with the most privilege have far more control over whether or not we can modify these risk factors. But there are still so many unknowns, and the less control someone feels they have, whether that's real or perceived lack of control, the more uncertainty there is. The leaders of the anti-vaccine movement offer this illusion of control when healthcare seems to have no answers. So when someone feels like there's something that they can control, like whether or not their child is vaccinated, it can be a matter of human nature to latch onto it. Now, I mentioned the pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine extremes. These are an example, of course, of that pro-science versus anti-science false dichotomy that I mentioned. So on the left, you see a quote from a popular YouTuber who I won't name, and they're talking about the awful pseudo-documentary known as Plandemic. And I won't go into details on what it's about, but it's about how the pandemic that we're dealing with right now was a conspiracy by governments and Bill Gates and others. So this blogger and medical doctor says, "I am shook that Americans are so freaking stupid as to take even a second of this horrible garbage conspiracy theory nonsense seriously. Really? You guys want me to sit and debunk this garbage? What is wrong with us as a people? What's gone wrong with our education? What's gone wrong with our common sense?" The first 5 seconds of that video reeks of crazy sauce, and no one can recognize that. It has millions of views. Now, while Plandemic was completely misleading, it relies on all of the usual tactics of persuasion to scare people about vaccines and to make conspiracy theories sound extremely convincing. It's not stupid or crazy to fall for something like this. Now, it was heartening to see others in the pro-vaccine camp call this guy out for being awful. And by the way, this rant was hosted on a continuing medical education accredited medical news service. The last that I checked, it was still up like several months ago. Now, this crappy hot take is hardly something that doctors should be learning bedside manner from. But anyhow, on the right, you see Robert F. Kennedy Jr., just another day in his life of exploiting the anxiety of Black people. So of course, that's another extreme that I certainly don't approve of. But these extremes don't represent the concerns of ordinary people from all walks of life. And I hope it doesn't represent the views of doctors who encounter parents with genuine questions. Now, finally, there's the Hydra's underbelly, where the most marginalized are overlooked as they face the brunt of injustice, including the injustices of misinformation, as well as the injustices of science itself. So those injustices include the fact that low vaccination rates impact the most vulnerable in our communities. For one, the impact of catching a vaccine-preventable disease will be worse for someone who already deals with lack of access to nutritious foods, lack of access to healthcare, and higher stress or hypertension. Now, as we wrote in a SciMoms post, the consequence of the anti-vaccine movement is that valuable resources continue to be spent readdressing these myths, such as the autism myth, when they could be much better spent understanding, in this case, autism, and building spaces and communities where autistic people are accepted. So this myth leads to the false and harmful notion that autistic children are damaged or that they could have been cured. The same anti-vaccine individuals who promote the idea that vaccine injuries can be detoxed or purged are also the ones who promote harmful autism remedies. Now, that was just an example. But the injustices perpetrated by science and the medical establishment, these injustices themselves are well documented, and they still have a major impact. So medical misogyny is real, all the way from research to clinicians not taking women and non-binary people seriously. Medical gaslighting is also real. That is clinicians suggesting that your symptoms are in your head. And this is especially true with women and people of color. And racism in America is so entrenched that finally, cities and counties in 2020 have started to declare racism a public health emergency after centuries of systemic racism have really constituted their own pandemic. And the declaration of racism as a public health crisis has happened in certain parts of Canada as well. Now, while Bill Gates probably isn't trying to implant us with microchips with the COVID-19 vaccines, the focus on conspiracy theories detracts from pertinent, valid analyses of the problem with entrusting global public health to billionaires. First and foremost, while correcting pesky, sometimes preposterous misinformation is worthwhile, those who communicate science must also steelman or repair flaws in an opponent's argument before refuting it. So for instance, using science to explain ad nauseum that no, Bill Gates is not injecting microchips via COVID-19 vaccines is arguably a good thing. But behind this misinformation are valid concerns, including that in this case, the Gates Foundation has absolutely backed what's called quantum dot microneedle patches that can be administered into the skin to track vaccinations. There's a publication in Science Magazine about it that I believe is open access if you want to take a look. Now, there are plenty of legitimate based worries about Bill and Melinda Gates and their foundation and the power billionaires and their philanthropy wield over the applications of science and technology. In other words, when we encounter SciComm, we need to ask ourselves, does this communication aim to simply correct the most preposterous bullshit, or does it address what's wrong with the status quo as it pertains to the issue at hand? To merely address the heads of the Hydra or the tip of the iceberg of people's concerns, I think fails everyone. And sure, we can separate the causes of these injustices into two columns, the injustices of misinformation and the injustices perpetrated, by science. But ultimately, in my view, all of these injustices are worthy foes. Now, folks who do SciComm well know that their work is crucial in staving off misinformation that harms. So as I put it sometimes, we can do it until we turn blue. But as we wrote in SciMoms, one of our posts, if vaccine manufacturers have been corrupt, if the healthcare system sometimes fail, and if pharma companies put profits over patients, why should parents vaccinate? And we could really write endless screeds about the overwhelming scientific consensus on vaccines, but really it keeps coming back to vaccines as an effective and low risk method of preventing harmful diseases. And this post goes on to talk about misassessment of risk and a few other factors. But the onus cannot be on science communication to significantly move a needle that's hovered more or less where it is today for hundreds of years. It's just not a fair burden. Now, there are some things that SciComm can do, and of course there's excellent SciComm that does do this well. I mentioned earlier that onus can't be on SciComm to garner trust from people, but that doesn't mean that SciComm can't make progress. So in 2021 especially, it's time to take it a level deeper and start addressing the roots of distrust. So to figure out what underlies people's concerns, one needs to steelman the criticism. Again, creating a stronger version of an argument that one is about to refute. So part of building a steelman includes taking stock of the entirety of the risk landscape. So the bigger the tree, as I mentioned, the bigger the impact of those factors. And that risk landscape looks different from person to person and from family to family. Another thing SciComm can do is to take stock of how social determinants of outcomes intersect with whatever the communication is about. So if I've learned one thing about science, it's that sometimes it can serve the status quo by putting the onus for outcomes on individuals, when in reality, the onus for outcomes is on the institutions that uphold inequality. So this is an exercise that can be done whenever someone undertakes communication about a specific chemical or other scientific issue relating to health. So to generalize, we often hear that X chemical or Y product is linked to cancer or even IQ and achievement and especially when the data are observational, but even when they're experimental, associations can appear to connect X chemical to or Y product to these outcomes. But more often than not, the correlation is only a correlation. So there's all of this misinformation about chemicals and products that proponents use to scare people into buying the alternative. Meanwhile, here are science communicators trying to debunk this, and it's like a game of whack-a-mole. But the social determinants of these outcomes, which are almost always rooted in inequality, end up being overlooked by much of this communication. So that brings me to the next thing that SciComm can do, and that is interrogating the history of science and how injustice and prejudice have shaped not only the scientific community, but the body of the science too. So it's really everywhere, from the science of reproductive health to the science of immunity. So in my view, the three drivers of good science communication are science, justice, and context. Another action SciComm can take is to beware of chemophobia. So these data are from a few years ago, and I would love to see a new study, but it's interesting, which is why I included it here. The Royal Society of Chemistry did a study on public attitudes to chemistry in 2015, and among the results was that 60% of respondents agreed that everything is made of chemicals. 70% agreed that everything, including water and oxygen, can be toxic at a certain dose. And 67% disagreed that all chemicals are man-made. So one of the authors of this study wrote a post about this, and he writes that what's particularly telling about the findings is not that the public doesn't understand chemists, but that chemists don't understand the public. So the RSC started by asking its members how they felt chemistry was perceived, and most expected a negative attitude. The fear of chemophobia, which he dubs chemophobia phobia, was certainly commonplace, but when the RSC turned to the public, the fear of chemicals didn't materialize in anywhere near the expected levels. People are quite capable of holding two meanings of chemical in their minds, and we should just try and ignore the use of the one that so grates. In fact, it may even be counterproductive to try and combat others' perceived misuse of the word chemicals. Now, other than those few tips, of course, there are some others, and I won't go into detail, but the rest of the onus to stem misinformation and garner trust cannot rest on the shoulders of SciComm. That's the responsibility of institutions. So what can institutions and industries and governments do? Well, it might sound radical, but they need to commit to interrogating systems of inequality that operate within and between institutions, like joining other groups in declaring racism a public health crisis. They need to commit to improve well-being for everyone, and they need to hold each other accountable. So really, unless institutions commit to real justice, SciComm will be doomed to forever slay the heads of the vaccine misinformation Hydra. Now, there are a few other communication theories that are applicable here that I've kind of built into this Hydra model, and I'll be explaining it in more detail in some upcoming projects. But to be clear, I've taken stock of quite a bit of the science of science communication. So it might seem like I'm leaving you on a negative note, but I really think it's a hopeful note in some ways, because there's hope in knowing what we're up against, and there's hope in activism and other work that leads to real social change. So with that, I have everything done with the presentation. So I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Kavin, for a very informative presentation. We'll now have an opportunity to ask questions, and we'll be using the chat window to accept questions by text. So please type in your questions and I will present it to Kavin. As I mentioned, the session's being recorded, so when you type in your question, please indicate if you want your name to be included when your question is posed. So I do have one question already, and this question is from Alex Beckman. The question is, would it be accurate to say that in the 1940s to 70s, the general public trust in vaccines and also in science in general was higher than it is today?
Yes, certainly. This trust has waxed and waned because of social and other issues, for sure. So yes, that period to some degree, the trust was a little bit better. But if you look at kind of the broad pattern, that's what I kind of focus on recently in some of my work.
Thank you. Another follow-on question. Do you think that mass culture, for example, Hollywood, is partially responsible for the mistrust because of the large volume of dystopian fiction? Science always seems to be the evil mad scientist and the immoral corporations.
I think that's a really interesting question, and I attended a great talk. This was now 2 years ago in 2018. I had gone to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign for a 2-day seminar called Genomics for Journalists. And there was a professor there who gave this whole talk on the last 100 years or so of media, especially film, science fiction film, in which genetics or genomics was portrayed as very scary and threatening, and something that could lead to an apocalypse or whatever. And so as to the question of whether, I think the question was whether celebrity culture and media, right, is partly responsible for this distrust. And I would say that the question of responsibility is a complex one, but again, like, of course, science fiction is just that, fiction. But I don't think that, I haven't seen any evidence that science fiction broadly drives distrust of vaccines or pharma. Rather, there are, of course, individuals that might see one of these movies or a celebrity saying something, for example, like the Gwyneth Paltrows of the world, or in this case, the Jenny McCarthys of the world. But they are to they are to blame for exploiting people. Certainly, that's not something that I personally approve of. But again, I see them as reactions to a sort of nebulous anxiety among the people. And when you really dig down into that anxiety, there's almost always something real there.
Thanks. This question's from Leslie Rosenblood. Are marginalized communities significantly more likely to be vaccine hesitant, broadly construed, as opposed to more privileged ones?
For instance, right now, when it comes to the COVID vaccines, the U.S. government and other organizations have made a special effort to address the concerns of especially Black Americans, but other non-white people and communities who are aware and wary of mistreatment by the medical community and the research community. To your question of whether these communities are more likely to distrust vaccines, if I think back to a couple of recent polls, the distrust tends to be the same or similar among different groups of people. So yeah, legitimate mistrust can certainly bleed into and influence all kinds of people who may not even have been historically affected by whatever real thing has happened. Now, of course, I mentioned a lot about history, but there are a slew of examples of medical research and clinicians doing problematic things to this day. It's happening right now. So,
Thanks. A question from Grace. Are people who buy lottery tickets, do you think they would be more likely to be vulnerable to being vaccine hesitant or less likely because they might be more or less risk averse? You could speculate on that.
Yeah, I would have to speculate. I haven't looked specifically at any studies involving subjects who tend to play lottery tickets. I don't know. If someone else wants to speculate about that at some point, please do hit me up on Twitter. I'm curious about what other people have found or think.
Thanks. Okay, so I don't see any more questions. If you did post one and I missed it, you're welcome to post it again. But otherwise, we'll proceed with the conclusion. What I'll do is I'll make a couple of announcements and give an opportunity for people to post additional questions if they have them. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and I'd like to draw your attention to a couple of upcoming events. On January 28th, Leslie Rosenblood, who's attended this meeting, and he's the CFIC Treasurer and Chair of Secularism, and he's going to discuss secularism in Canada. What is it, what it isn't, and why it's the means to maximal freedom for all. Then coming up later on February 28th, we're going to have philosopher Greg Caruso. He's going to speak about free will, punishment, and criminal justice. We have a number of other talks coming up in March and April, and also planning is in the works for an online conference coming in May. So please check out Meetup, Facebook, or the Centre for Inquiry Canada website for more information. Now, I have a couple of questions have now come up. What part does religion play in vaccine hesitancy? Are you there, Kevin?
Hear me, right?
I didn't hear you. I think you were on mute.
Oh, okay. What role does religion play in vaccine hesitancy? I've heard a few different religious justifications to try and oppose vaccines, so that's certainly there. But I don't think that religion plays any more of a special role than than other kind of ideologies. One interesting situation happened last year, and that was when and I know this because I have a friend who is Baha'i, and many Baha'i were asking religious leaders about vaccines, and there's some language in the Baha'i book, which I apologize, I forget what it's called, about like the purity of the body. And I don't remember the details. I'll have to look it up, and I can send that to Diana and Shauna if people are interested. But essentially, what the Baha'i governing bodies did was to write a very clear statement saying that, interpreting this language that people were asking about, saying that this language should not be used to justify forgoing vaccines, or to justify an exemption from vaccines to send your child to school. So, there's two sides to that. I personally have been atheist my whole life. I was raised atheist by a scientist, and yet somehow at this stage in my life, I tend to not see religion as much of a unique problem. Of course, there are many atrocities attributable to religion to this day, but there there are plenty of equally bad atrocities committed in the name of quote unquote science and reason.
Thanks. And we have one final question. This is from Trevor. If the issues are much deeper than the head of the Hydra and too big to deal with in a conversation, what do you suggest we can do when we encounter anti-vax or vaccine hesitant individuals?
Right. So I would say that, to clarify, the conversations are always important. So when I talk about the Hydra, I'm referring generally to groups of people, but also in an individual conversation. Some of those tips that I gave for steel manning the question or the opposition come into play in a one-on-one conversation, or like a social media conversation as well. So really steel manning, or correcting or building a strong case for the question or the doubt that a person has, I think is important, along with taking stock of those those other things that I mentioned in my slides.
Okay. I guess, well, there's a couple of other questions come in. I guess we'll just take a little bit more time because is it true that this one's from Joshua, is it true that vaccine misinformation thrives in areas far removed from certain diseases? Is vaccine misinformation less effective in countries where some of the obsolete diseases are still around?
Can you repeat that? It seems a little...
So for example, do we have more vaccine hesitancy in North America where we have not seen vaccine preventable diseases in a long time, as opposed to other places?
Of course, I mean, we could look at a lot of specific cases, but in my experience, for instance, much of my family and also many family friends live in India, and there are vaccine preventable diseases that occur there, and there is anti-vaccine sentiment or just kind of distrust among a lot of people.
Okay. Well, thanks. We're going to conclude now. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And as Mark mentioned at the beginning, CFIC is Canada's only national nonprofit for scientific inquiry and secular community. We hope that those of you who are not already members will consider purchasing a membership. We'll include a link to our membership page in the chat window and also through Meetup. Hope that you'll consider joining. Not only does your membership provide financial support to CFIC, it also adds your voice to that of others who support science, critical thinking, and secularism. As we grow in numbers, so does our influence with government decision makers and also with the public opinion that guides them. We advocate for evidence-based decisions on government policies, and healthcare, public education, and human rights. So we ask you to please consider a membership at $30 a year. I'd like to thank the CFIC volunteers who assisted with this talk. And also I'd like to once again, I invite anybody who would be interested in being a volunteer, check us out on the website. Again, I'd like to thank Kavin for being our speaker. And Zoom, as we all know by now, doesn't do well with audible clapping, but they've put in this feature where you can use a clap icon. So I'd like everybody, if you'd like to express your appreciation, use the icon that you can find by clapping or tapping or clicking on the participants icon and then selecting more. Or you can also wave in your screen or clap visually or whatever you like. But thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. I've never seen this clap feature. That's cool. Thank you.